welcome back, everyone. This is Chase Anderson, and joining me today as a part of our History of Gear series is Sally McCoy. Thanks for joining me. I should touch on a few things before we dive in, but a Knowles graduate, held significant senior leadership positions at the North Face, Sierra Designs, Camelbak, founding member of so many impactful organizations, Conservation Alliance, ORCA, now OIA, Outdoor Women's Industry Coalition, now Camber. You've just had such a significant impact on this industry and have been so helpful. Before we started recording, just talking about the history of this industry, you certainly have a passion for telling the story of this industry. So it's great to be able to talk to you and tell your story and just help share your place in the history of this industry. So thanks for joining me.
Chase, thanks for doing this in the middle of the 2020 pandemic. So
yeah, we should put a timestamp on the conversation. It'd be fun to do all of these in person. I wish that we could all be at the Outdoor Retailer Show and be having these conversations there. But unfortunately, we're in the situation that we're in. But part of that, in in March, when everything really broke out, that's when, I started working from home here at the university, and I started having conversations with Bruce Johnson, who started his History of Gear project. And I just started I thought, well, why don't I just, I've wanted to start telling stories and record oral histories of people in the outdoor industry. What's stopping me, right? Sometimes I feel like we think, well, perfect is the enemy of good, right? Or however that phrase goes. And at this point, I think it's just important that we get those stories down, right? And so in March of 2020, we just started recording with anyone who is willing to share their story. So appreciate you being willing to share yours. We're going to cover a lot of territory because you've had such an impact at so many different companies and organizations. So I want to do this justice, but wanted to start off with really how you got into the outdoor industry. And I know you've shared this in other places, but do you mind sharing a little bit about your background, or at least your first exposure to the outdoors? When did the outdoors really capture your attention, and that's when you really felt like you wanted to be a part of the outdoors and the outdoor industry?
Well, those are two different things, right? Growing up in North Carolina, I grew up in out in Charlotte, which at the time was about 150,000 people. It wasn't the big city it is now, but my father's family was from different sides of the county, and every weekend we'd spend it out on various great aunts and uncles and grandfathers' farms. And I loved the woods. And we were lucky in that every August we'd spend time in the North Carolina mountains, Black Mountains, just near the Blue Ridge Parkway. And during that time, we got to run pretty much free. We were expected home for dinner, but that was it. And a little place called Monterey. So I just loved the outdoors and loved being outside. And my brothers, I had three older brothers, and they were all Boy Scouts, and they got to do some climbing. So that was interesting to me. And my parents didn't do climbing, but they took us my first overnight hike. We went 10 miles, which I'm still, after I did my first one with my kids, I was like, wow, that was crazy. And in the Great Smoky Mountains. And, I was pretty much hooked from that time. And so it was more a matter of how do I get outdoors, and love my parents. But let me just tell you, tying rocks around the end of polyethylenes and setting up tarps on slopes and sleeping in the rain I was like, there has to be a better way. So I badgered the Boy Scouts, and they finally let me rappel off the church, but they would never let me go on trips. So I found out about Knowles, and this was back you had to be 13 to go to Knowles. And it was an investment, right? It was cheap. Even nobody had ever heard of it. But I was obsessed with going. And so I convinced my parents that was going to be a great event. And so I got to do Knowles in 74 when I was 13. And it was epic then. I mean, the Knowles folks would, my unfortunate record is every Knowles course, and I did 2 of them, an instructor got evacuated. But it was it was thrilling in 5 weeks in the Wind Rivers, and like I went in weighing 100 pounds and carrying a 70-pound pack, and came out weighing 90. But it was, I certainly fell in love with the West, and I'd fallen in love with the West on kind of a family in the back of the station wagon trip in '68. So I think that cemented my love of the outdoors, and I think that's where I didn't get to it really knowing there was an industry. I knew the retailers. Now, I was a co-op member at REI from I think 12 or 13 on, and Allenby's and Jesse Brown's were the key people in Charlotte, and you knew them. And then I picked my college based on they had a great outing club and they had overseas programs. So I went to Dartmouth College, and that continued it. And then built trail in Arkansas because I couldn't get a job in '82. I wanted to work for the Nature Conservancy, and they weren't hiring anybody. It was a recession of '82. So I built trail, and then I got a one-way ticket around the world. And that was actually, believe it or not, I got into China right when they were opening from 3 cities to 27. And look, everybody was in Mao jackets, and China was very closed, and I didn't know what I was doing. In fact, ended up in the cities I wasn't supposed to be in, got my wallet stolen, climbed a Meishan and a pilgrimage. It was a wild trip, that part of it. But I was like, wow, for some reason it hit me that business affects how people live more than anything. My parents were both doctors, and I thought about being a doctor. I was like, well, you're doing good work if you're a doctor. But after that, I was like, well, you could see China was about to burst forward. It was, and I was like, well, really, business affects how people live. And this was long before double bottom lines. I was like, so I got to learn how to do business. And for some reason, and it was probably youthful immaturity, but or maybe self-preservation, I didn't want to go to business school. Because I felt like if I went to business school, I'd end up on Wall Street being an investment banker. And as far as I'm concerned, they were leeches, which becomes very ironic later in my life. And I can be a very competitive person. I thought, well, if I do that, I'm going to get stuck, working in one of these jobs like investment banking, and I don't want to do that. And I wanted to live in Jackson, and I wanted to be able to get gear. I didn't know that nobody made it yet that would work for me. So that was literally that shred of an idea is what got me into the outdoor industry. I then moved to California, and there were a lot of my friends living in any geographic area. Anybody, Dartmouth College alums, basically, that's a beautiful geographic area, you'll find them. So I had friends in Seattle and San Francisco, and I just ended up in San Francisco. And that was kind of the hub or the birthplace in many ways of the outdoor industry, at least in my mind. And then I wrote Patagonia, I wrote, Black Diamond, I wrote everybody trying to get a job. And eventually, after working the holidays at Orvis and doing all kinds of terrible jobs to try to earn a living, I talked my way into an entry-level job in the North Face. So that's how I ended up there.
So did you ever have an experience like early on using gear? Well, it seems like for most people who end up in the outdoor industry, it's the activity first, that's that exposure, getting, being surrounded by the gear, using it daily. Was there a moment where you realized someone makes this, right? And I want to be a part of that process. I want to be a part of, did you have some kind of awakening there or realization?
I don't think I was that deep. Like many people, I was like, well, I got to get a pro deal on some of this gear. And, but so I think I was motivated to get some of the better gear. And then I was more abstractly interested in how to do good business, and intuitively thought the outdoor industry, it was products that I knew and that I liked. And in hindsight, I was dissatisfied with some in some ways. And so I think that's an important drive. You don't go into this business or you didn't in those days, unless you had a real passion for it, I think.
Right.
Or it was completely accidental and you had a skill. Like I didn't have any of the skills. I didn't have finance skills. I didn't have anything else. So I had my passion and my interest and my willingness to do almost anything in the space.
Right. What were some of those pieces of gear that failed and maybe helped motivate you or helped you realize that there are people out there who could make it better? Did you have any of those experiences?
Oh, well, you have so many, right? I mean, we used, at Knowles, we used, old wool sweaters that were sewn together for long wool sweaters. You had, like I said, my family used polyethylene tarps. I was like, which are miserable. Even at Knowles, we just used fly shades, right? We didn't carry tents in those days. Sleeping bags were, for me, I'm, 5'4". Sleeping bags were huge and lumpy and yeah, inefficient, and that was clear to me. And look, I've been around so long that I remember Insulite was a revelation. So I mean, the every single thing I touched could be improved. Stoves, everything. So it seemed wide open to me at that point.
It seems like in my conversations with, those who've gotten into the outdoors and are part of the history of the industry and led to a lot of the innovations that we enjoy today, it seems very common. Like Jerry and Bar. When I was diving into the history of those companies, it seemed like that was the era of post World War II army surplus. Like there was kind of an influx of gear in the country, and so you had people who couldn't access gear now are accessing gear, and quickly realizing some of the deficiencies of some of those pieces of equipment. So it kind of seems like innovation is always preceded by someone using something that doesn't work, right?
Well, right. I mean, Dick Kelty, I still have the 1976 Kelty Tioga pack. And then the Lowe brothers came in with their internal frame pack. And I mean, to this day, they have different uses, but it was so much more. I mean, my first backpacking trip, I carried a little rucksack with towels strapped to the straps, and there was no waist belt. And let me just tell you, that's miserable. So yeah, I do think the outdoors for us a turnoff, frankly, because um, in those days it was more about, oh yeah, you just got to endure it and tough it out or whatever. And then I think innovation made it a little more accessible for people and more comfortable, and that was fun.
Right, right. Well, do you mind sharing a little bit more, about that? How you got into the North Face. You kind of teed that up, but how did you break in?
Well, I wrote letters, which will seem foreign to people today. Yes, we didn't even have faxes. So I wrote letters. I begged for interviews. Jack Gilbert became somebody that had mercy on me at the North Face. He was actually kind of phasing out at that time, but I always wrote him and anybody I met thank you notes and kept trying to get a job there. But I wrote Denise Friend at REI. I wrote Peter Metcalf at Black Diamond. I wrote everybody. I would try to find out. I'd call people at the companies. I'd talk to the receptionist and try to find out who did what. And because no internet, and you had to be scrappy in those days. And 82, 83 was recession period. And it was certainly before there was a boom again. It was actually kind of the first real period. There had been this really big growth, as I understand it, and some of the other people you're interviewing will confirm or deny it, but the outdoor industry boomed right in the 60s. There were some transitions in the 60s, early 70s. I think that might have been when Sierra Designs was sold the first time, but it had kind of boomed, and then there was a little bit of a lull. And so trying to get in at this time, I think was hard. But so I eventually got in at an entry level position in the office of the retail part of the North Face. And at the time, I think it's super interesting to think. So this was April of 84 is when I got a job there. And every single thing the North Face made was made here in Berkeley. The factory was here. There were 18 different languages spoken in the factory. It was a fascinating, creative period. And by the time I left, which was the very end of 1990, beginning of 91, there had been a mass migration. I mean, between 87 and 90, um, a huge part of all the product lines went overseas. Now, and ironically, of course, the needlework and the pricing in China made for another burst of innovation because, of course, the pricing and what we could do. But I learned so much from. It was lucky for me I ended up at the North Face because North Face did everything. It did, retail, maybe not well, but they bought Holly Bar. They did retail. But more importantly, they did design from scratch in manufacturing. And we're committed to it. We made investments, and we had one of the first automated. I don't think it ever did much, but we had one of the first automated lines to make our sewing lines better. And we had the most brilliant engineers in the North Face were Asian women. So it was a fascinating time.
Right. I guess when did you transition into? I guess you were kind of just doing what were you doing at that time? Retail in the office.
I, I basically was doing the mail order, which
Okay.
retailers didn't really want us doing, but when people really wanted product, there were like, I remember to this day, there were 9 steps in trying to get a product out the door. And I was like, Lord, this is so boring and tedious. We have to make this shorter. So I'd go around and lobby people to help me make that process shorter. And then I looked for mistakes in cost of goods sold on the computer. Um, it was super tedious. Both of those jobs probably shouldn't have existed in a more efficient place, but it got me in the doors. And within 7 months, I talked my way upstairs to being an assistant sales manager, which at the time in the equipment and outerwear areas. And the guy that came over to be the sales manager had run demand planning essentially at the factory. So actually, he taught me a tremendous amount about, that I had access into the factory and whatnot. And together we learned sales and distribution. And Jim only stayed in that job a year before he got hired, I think by Royal Robbins maybe. And they divided the area and they gave me equipment. And I was, I think 26 maybe, 25 maybe, 25 years old. And so I learned a tremendous amount from the sales reps. I spent the time on the road, the next 2 years basically on the road, and Mark and the whole design area where nobody was particularly interested in equipment then. So I was able to, say, hey, this is what we want, and how about this, and how about that. And you worked with the pattern makers, worked with the designers. It was super fun. It was really a tremendous learning opportunity for me because nobody cared. Ski wear was what was hot, and they didn't care necessarily. They were like, oh yeah, we kind of need equipment, and she seems to like it. So
So this was about 84, 85?
I probably, no, 85 and 86 were the 2 years I probably spent doing sales management, because 87 I was lucky enough the North Face decided to sponsor an Everest climb, and Everest had been a little bit out of fashion for a while, and no American woman had summited, which is hard to believe, right? And in 87, and anyway, they said, well, Tom Lane, who was the ski wear sales manager, was trying to get Snowbird to their uniform business. So the ski business at that time was the hottest area, which is hard to understand for people probably. And Tom was a great sales manager, and he really wanted Snowbird. And Dick Bass had been the first guy to do the 7 summits. And was a great, interesting guy. And so basically part of getting it was, great, we'll sponsor this Everest climb, but why don't we send one of our own? And they looked around and they were like, well, you seem to be the only one who could do this, so why don't you go do this? And so I got paid to go on the climb. And fortunately, there were some smart people. Mary Scott was like, we need good pictures. So we got Chris Noble to join as part of that. Chris was a very famous at the time ski and climbing photographer. And it actually ended up, I thought I scored, but in the final analysis, it was one of the best business moves North Face did. because I we had the mountain jacket, and the bibs, the earliest versions, but coming out of that became the impetus for what became the expedition systems, the Lhotse and the Denali and things that are kind of vintage at this point, iconic. And it really began the shift from ski wear to outerwear and kind of that positioning. And Chris's photographs were beautiful, and it's sort of unbelievable to think about it, but North Face had earlier had a relationship with Ned Gillette and had those pictures, but our cupboards were bare. And so I came back from that, and the company was essentially for sale. So I came back in November of '87. We did not summit. It was the worst storm in 40 years that blew us off. It was the same day the stock market collapsed.
Wow.
October 19th, 1987. I think we had one of the first people that was guided. It was Steve Fawcett, who later set the record for the balloon around the world or something like that. Nice guy. I think he paid like 40 grand to go. And he literally went to Camp 1, and I took the radio call that night, and he said, "Call me a yak." And I'm like, "Okay, yak." And he's like, "No, I want you to call me a yak." I said, "Steve, there's no communication. You know, we're letters are 3 weeks away. Like somebody's got to hike down. I mean, what are you talking about?" It's like, "I've decided I can't summit." And I don't remember what he thought, but he was prescient, and he actually left and made it back. And I think he was a commodities. I can't remember what he traded, but he saved himself a fortune by being back at home.
Wow.
And that storm hit and killed 6 people in the Khumbu, but killed nobody on Everest. I mean, the storm of '96 was not nearly as severe, but people were high up on the mountain. And but we didn't know a lot then. We didn't know that this was a post-monsoon climb. And look, May is the time to summit if you want to summit. And you were out of touch. And that year we had to, I had to walk in with most of the gear all the way from Jiri. So you had to, it was a much more, it was totally different than I think the way things are now, but it was still, but it was great fun, and it was fun for me, a great opportunity for me, but it was weird to come back and the company was in turmoil and we were growing wholesale at 40%, retail was losing money, but there was not agreement in management. And so I came back and people were marching through on a sale process. I mean, I think Nike turned us down and the price was $5 million in assumed liabilities. Wow. And you can ask some of the others if that's true, but that I remember that very clearly. I was like, wow. And then by the spring of, I think May of '88, Bill Simon bought it. And that's when I became basically in charge of marketing, all product first and then marketing too. So that began another chapter of the North Face, really. It's quite different.
Right. What was it like for you you were quickly rising in the ranks and getting a variety of experiences, seeing different parts of the business. Did it feel like a short amount of time? It seems like a short amount of time for anyone. What was that experience like to just get to know the business so quickly and really jump through a few different positions?
Well, it was a great opportunity. It was the perfect size company. I was interested in almost every area, and people were willing to talk to me. And I do think that, look, there were extraordinarily talented people at the North Face then. It was, I count myself lucky. And I think the generation of leadership, the Jack Gilberts and Mark Ericksons and Haps and everybody else, they'd gone through a couple of cycles already. In some ways, they might have been bored. And I was just extraordinarily passionate about it. And I wouldn't say that one of the unsung heroes of building the outdoor industry were the reps. The reps were the conduits to the store. So I was, but at the same time, my interest became still on how do you do business and how do you do it ethically. And I did spend a bunch of time thinking I'd go back to kind of a divinity school, business school. And it was when I got the opportunity to really lead what I consider the key areas of the company, that I decided not to do that. And that was a critical decision for me. And then I became disillusioned, actually, once we were growing the company, and it was clear to me that we weren't going to be able to keep our promises. Like, I spent a bunch of time in Asia, in China, and I knew Odyssey, who had bought us, was kind of a house of cards. I mean, and I, I couldn't, really reason I left is because we weren't going to be able to keep our promises to the retailers and to everybody else. It wasn't the quality of gear was bad. It was not. It was, we weren't going to deliver, and we weren't doing the things that were going to make it better. And I felt like I was leading people to invest a lot of time and, a ton of work to make something happen, and it wasn't going to get all the way to fulfillment. And it was basically because of leadership at that time. I mean, Bill Simon's an incredibly creative guy, but there was so much going on that it was a little disillusioning. So, I think I quit by the time I was either 29 or 30, probably 30, and Bill wanted me to take a leave of absence, but I went and worked on a book with Paul Hawken at that point, more about what I was interested in. So while it was an incredible opportunity, it was also a time that didn't have a lot of clarity, and I didn't know anything about capital and how to keep your promises, but I just knew what I thought was, what I could participate in, what I couldn't.
It kind of seems like that whole era, I don't know if this is the same for other companies at the time, but it seemed like there was a lot of buying and selling going on. It's kind of a big transition phase, well, at least for the North Face, to say the least. But
bought Sierra Designs in '86, which is sort of crazy too. And yes, it was a consolidation phase because Odyssey bought Marmot and bought North Face, Sierra Designs, Head. I don't remember who else they owned. And in hindsight, now I understand it a little bit more. There were, really high interest rates, and it was hard to get funding, and the none of us probably knew how to plan our businesses quite like that. And you were also shifting from domestic making to overseas. And now I understand it's like, okay, the capital requirements. Like, I remember at North Face, they bought Sierra Designs, and they didn't really kind of realize the cash planning, and they put their LCs out for Sierra Designs tents or whatever, and they didn't have enough money to buy what they needed to make it the North Face because the timing was different, right? It was, you look back at now and it seems basic, but imagine interest rates were probably 14 or 15% back then. And operating cycles were long on cash. Some of that boring business stuff came into play.
I imagine that was a crash course for you, and a lot that you would then take on to your other future leadership positions. How much did that period of time give you an education for, where you would be going, in the next few years?
I look back, I'm like, wow, I should have understood more than I did. And maybe I should have gone to business school. What I took away is, look, there were so many incredibly creative people at the North Face. To this day, it was one of the most exciting environments and one of the most diverse environments, which I think really gets lost in a lot of the telling. But the diversity, 18 languages, think about that. In our sample sewing, we had, 3 different languages, even in the sample room, right, of the design department. It was fun. And for me, growing up in the South, it was great exposure to particularly mostly Asian cultures, Filipino and Chinese and Korean. So I loved all that. But I think about it, and I don't, because when we went to Odyssey, they got funded basically from the Japan real estate. So if I kind of look at it back now, I didn't understand capital. And so I went on to understand that, and my advice to people is pay attention to who owns it and what their goals are, what their real goals are, and how they respond to that. So I think I then worked on a nonprofit, I worked for this nonprofit, and then I came back eventually, and I did Sierra Designs because I felt like, well, these are really ethical people that own it. and they were ethical, but they should have owned an apartment building. They weren't willing to invest and grow. So I kind of did, if you look at my career, I went through these things before finally deciding to be an investment banker and learning about capital. And then it was understanding the levers that let me go to Camelbak, and basically it could have gone either way with Camelbak's capital structure. And that's a whole nother story. That's a fascinating story. So I think it was, if you look at the arc of my business career, it is really understanding how capital can enable or disempower what the culture is. And so it's not a very interesting thing for most people, and maybe on this broadcast, but it's true.
Well, no, I think that's definitely a huge takeaway, and I think it's relevant to the industry that we see now, right? I don't know, I'd be curious your perspective on the state of the industry now. It's interesting you mentioning the consolidation that was happening, and I feel like we live in an industry that is, really there's a lot of consolidation happening right now. So maybe some parallels that were, between the two, but I don't know if you could, if there was more consolidation then or now, but I think those are super relevant lessons to just kind of the current state of the industry and how businesses run now. But what were some of the values that you already carried your own values to your role at the North Face? Are there any that you feel like really stuck out that the company was promoting at the time? You mentioned diversity being a huge focal point there at the time. But what are some of the values that maybe were strengthened, or new values that you developed by being there?
Well, keep in mind, I was young and naive, and I was just like, great, these are all going to be people who are really committed to really committed to the environment and all these things. And look, it wasn't equal for women. It wasn't equal for racially or any other way. Just because, not because people weren't broad-minded, but we're part of our own culture, right? So I don't want to whitewash it. I mean, I had to go in and I found out that I was not making equal wages with somebody that I could argue was less productive. And the president told me that I was, he had to provide for his wife. And I was like, well, his wife is a partner at a law firm and makes 4 times what we do. And besides which, I think that's illegal. So I eventually won that, by the way, but it was not, and actually it was Jim Carrey who basically, when I got promoted to the upstairs in sales, he basically gave me a list of what everybody made at the company. And he said, you'll hear rumors of this. I just prefer to show you the reality. And that was like so strikingly ahead of like what people are talking about now. And I was thinking, wow, I don't know if you should do this, but it was very illustrative. But I would be with executives, and it was super fun. Like you were accessible at parties and various things. But I think Hap would tell you himself that the benefit of being in the Bay Area is you could get smart, motivated people that wanted to be in the industry, and you didn't have to pay them a lot. I remember somebody told me going into the industry, somebody that worked at Trailwise said, look, become an investment banker, you'll work just as much here for a quarter of the money. But money wasn't what was motivating me, and that didn't strike me as funny till years later. I was just like, yeah, I don't want to be one of those people. Not even really understanding what they did, by the way. But I think, but I've gotten off topic. What is it you want to?
Well, I think you're speaking exactly to that. Maybe values that maybe if the company espoused or said that they espoused, or maybe values that the company wasn't promoting, that you noticed, and that maybe helped bolster things that you wanted to promote, and companies that you would lead in the future. You're definitely speaking to that question now. But
well, I will give the leadership team at the North Face credit. I mean, the one thing, and I think, sorry, that's my pooch. The one thing that they were always consistent on was the lifetime warranty, and 100% standing behind the product. I mean, North Face had a state-of-the-art lab. They took all of that beyond incredibly seriously. We had a great warranty area. We called it repairs in those days. And there was, you were never on thin ice or anything else as long as it was about the quality of the product, right? I mean, I think that was, and the lifetime warranty, and I think all those were real values. And I don't think there were differences in the management team in the latter days before I went to a sale, but that was never ever in question, even when they were in a cash crunch or anything else. So I think that that's important, and I honestly think that's a core value in the outdoor industry. They lived that, and they lived they went on, and even, Bill Simon was the one who is credited by Wally, CEO of REI at the time, with the concept, although Bill didn't remember at the time we were driving to the founding of the Conservation Alliance, of the idea. And the idea for the Conservation Alliance came, they were promoting a backpack tax. This comes up, and it's coming up again. Why do people that hunt game have to buy a special stamp, and people that, hike don't? And the argument from the industry, which I think is a good one, is, look, we pay all these tariffs, extraordinary amount of tariffs. Our goods are really highly taxed. But we wanted to be proactive, and Yvonne was very instrumental, Yvonne and Paul Tebble from Patagonia, at saying 100% pass through. And so there was, North Face and Patagonia did not mix in those days. Some of the executives, knew each other, but certainly the ownership didn't. And that was the beginning. And I would say Bill gets credit for helping to bridge that. It was really Wally that brought North Face and Patagonia together in the same room. And then George Grabner was at Kelty. And so that was also a key value of, like, North Face could have used that 10 grand, which sounds like nothing nowadays, but it was significant money then for anything else. But the industry decided to swing to its better angels on that move. And I think so I think there's a sincere push around conservation. And there were things that I think were missing that were obvious to me, I think, from my own values of people need an opportunity to advance, people need as much equal treatment, people need, the more we've gone on as a society, you see your own implicit bias, you learn, and you're continually learning. I'm learning every day, but how do you begin to build that into an organization? And I think I saw organizational opportunity in, people that had great talents that were not as effectively being used. And I don't think it was out of spite. I think it was, frankly, interest at the time or whatever else. It was, you are captive a little bit in some of your thinking around the time. But I would say those fundamentals, like the part where I wouldn't, and I don't think this happened I think this happened more as Odyssey couldn't deliver. We always tried to be straightforward with our partners. I think that was a value as well.
You brought up the Conservation Alliance, which I'm glad you did, because I feel like that's a good transition point. When did you start getting involved in that? Yeah, that sounds like while you were still at the North Face.
Well, I went to that founding meeting, and that was, I think it was 89. And the great thing about the Conservation Alliance was it was very simple. REI was going to take care of the money, and Patagonia was going to advise on the grantees, which became a strength certainly during John Sterling's time. So it was a very simple, the organization was set up, and after the first meeting, it became the industry united behind it. And then later it became, but it was very simple to run. And then I can't remember, might have been Bruce Hamilton who asked me to be on the ORCA organizing committee. And that's what became OIA. So I later came back during a transition period of the Conservation Alliance and served as chair. But that was a later phase. I think that was, I'd have to look, but near 2000 maybe. No, I'm getting, that's wrong. That was OIA, it was near 2000. I think I was chair in maybe 09 or 10 or somewhere in there of the Conservation Alliance.
Well, you were involved in so many of these organizations outside of your primary role at these different companies. I could see how you get some of the timeline mixed up there. Because at the same point in time, you're involved with Orca, creation of Orca. Is that 89?
It's also 89. And
Okay.
so basically I went from that founding meeting of the Conservation Alliance to, well, that one's going to be simple to run. North Face needs to be involved in this, and it was Steve Pfeiffer and Belinda Sanda and Woodward and I think Denise Friend and maybe Connie Sell from A16. And they're like, you need to be on this organizing committee. And Al Gunner did a tremendous amount. Al Gunner was a rep and a really smart guy. He just died this year in Colorado, and it was a volunteer board, and it was a heavy lift. It was a super heavy lift. I remember one of the funniest things was we, initially we didn't even have a part-time, ED, and we were basically trying to figure out what we were. And sporting goods manufacturers gave us 10 grand gift, and we decided we wanted to help retailers and help them put on events, and that's when we hired Michael Hodgson to do the event guidebook, and we were casting around. And I remember the first time we went to DC because we thought we needed a voice in DC, but a lot of people were like, the hell with DC, we don't want to go there. But a bunch of us went in, actually this leaks to when I was in Sierra Designs in 93. And I think we stayed drunk for 3 days in a hotel room, and I don't even think we met with a staffer, but that began our presence, which later, a decade later, we were meeting with, I remember the first Secretary of Interior we met with was Gail Norton. And that's a funny story. And later went on, and of course, Sally Jewell went on to be secretary, but it began with deep ambivalence, which I think a lot of the outdoor industry feels about big corporations and that sort of thing. I mean, we were kind of a counterculture industry in many ways. It's now become a little more corporate.
Right. It definitely has, especially with a company like the North Face, well, being part of VF Corporation, right? It's like the industry has definitely shifted more that way and is very active in those conversations. But what was some of the main motivation behind creating Orca, or Outdoor Recreation Coalition of America? Is that right? Did I get all of my letters right?
Yeah,
What
that was such a bad name. I was like, really, a whale of an idea? I was kind of like, oh, come on. It was to have a voice in DC and to be kind of organized. I think Al Gunner was very in the forefront of understanding that we probably ought to quantify ourselves and, at different times. I mean, I think we're seeing, look, with this pandemic, we're seeing an explosion of interest in the outdoor industry. And I've been serving, I just finished this chair a year ago of the Outdoor Foundation, which is really targeted towards engagement and really engagement across vast communities. And we can talk about that separately, but at various times there have been lulls in participation and interest in our activities. And so I think some of these folks were pressing about seeing we probably ought to organize collaboratively, and whether it's identifying how to support participation or whether it's having a voice. And that could be anything from tariffs to, candidly, of course, the land issues. And that was, and then supporting retailers, which I think it's always been very difficult to figure out how to do that effectively. I mean, I think it's every time I've been actively involved in OIA, it's always that difficult question, how do you do that? And so, but those were in the early days, that was what we were trying to figure out, and we were amateurs at it. So
who was the kind of the driving force behind the creation of that organization? Was there one company that really drove that and was the convener, or were a lot of people kind of feeling this need, being drawn to some idea like this, and you kind of naturally came together? Who really sparked that?
I'm not 100% sure. Steve Pfeiffer and at MEI, which it doesn't exist anymore, but Steve was a great guy. His travel company, and I don't think it exists anymore, but I don't say that. Belinda Santa at Backpackers Pantry, Bob Woodward at Snooze, Al Gunner, who was a rep for North Face, and I'm sure there were others, but off the top of my head, And then North Face held that's how I ended up involved, was North Face. There needed to be a meeting in person, right?
Mm-hmm.
There needed to be a meeting in person, and we held it. And there were some other people, I have to try to figure out who they were. But really, it was an extraordinary amount of volunteer time. It was extraordinarily heavy lift early on. Connie Self at A16, Denise Friend, and Connie became the first chair, and then Denise went after her, and we then hired a part-time ED. But it was really trying to coalesce a counterculture industry around a need for us to collaborate on some business topics.
Mm-hmm.
And land in lobbying was a business topic too. And quantifying the industry was, a lot of people were like, why would we do that? So there were, as you can imagine, it was wonderful being in a small counterculture industry with a strong retailer base. But winds of change were already beginning to happen then.
Right. How does it feel? I mean, I feel like, was it last year, maybe the year before, is when the Bureau of Economic Analysis added the outdoor industry to some of their metrics.
Um,
I mean, there we go. We got
yeah,
another guest. Who's this?
this is Sydney the pointer.
How does that make you feel, being a part of some of these early conversations that have led, maybe it took longer than maybe hoped, but it seems like at the federal level, there's that recognition, right? At least economic impact of the industry is being measured, and certainly at the state levels now, with state offices of outdoor recreation popping up, especially in the last 10 years. I think you can trace a lot of that indirectly or directly back to this focus, a group coming together and pushing the need to have these conversations.
There, look, Orca saved the climbing industry in 1991, along with really REI, Dan Dusich and Terry Perlman, and of course the climbers themselves and the climbing companies. But I became solidified in a need for OIA when I saw that, wow, climbing almost became something that was sold out of the back of cars like drugs, because there was such a liability crisis. And OIA provided the forum for the climbing specialty group to get together and to deal with that. And so I was like, yes, there's a real need here. And certainly the quantifying became, OIA did their own study, and that was cited. Any of you who've been on lobbying trips have cited that. And then to finally get it made as part of the federal accounting of it, and get it statewide in the statewide offices. But there's an opportunity to unify those. And that's one of the reasons I stepped back on the Outdoor Foundation board, was because our engagement, we've quantified it, but now we have to quantify participation and do it down to the congressional level. So one thing I've learned is everything has to become congressional level, or certainly state, to have impact, because our positive economic impact is huge. And I think the story we haven't told as well, because it's harder in the days of, post Citizens United. Sydney, come here. Come on. Is that we're small businesses, right? That study counts the motel besides the river put in, right? It's not just your outdoor shops and your gear companies you've heard of. Mm-hmm. And so we don't have the voice. And so, but we are a very American activity. And if you look at the 1986 President's Reports on Americans Outdoors, 66% of Americans identified themselves as outdoors people in that report. Now, to my knowledge, that hasn't been done again, but I would say the participation study done by the Outdoor Foundation shows how drastically that's dropped. And as we become urbanized, that identification hasn't happened. But now we're seeing, and I think it's terribly important we support this. They've got 4 trial cities of Thrive Outside, but we're also tracing activity, which the only bright side of the pandemic in my mind is this, that you have found Americans all over the place identifying with their local parks and going outdoors, and the expression in different communities. And it's not the outdoor industry telling them how to go outside, it's them deciding how to go outside. And it's very important, it's community led. And I think that engagement and participation combined with economic impact will help our country make better policies. So you can tell I feel passionately about it. And I feel like we're close to making that happen. So I would say if you look at it, OIA made a huge impact on quantifying the industry, but also it was the Eco Index and all the people working on that that really created HIG and created a lot of that. I mean, we've been leaders in some important areas by influence, frankly. And I think that that's hopefully that will happen again we'll be part of a movement with the Outdoor Foundation as well.
Right, absolutely. And I think, especially now, there's,
Yeah.
I think it's been interesting, this idea of participation and this definition of what outdoor activity is,
Mhm.
I feel like is expanding, in a lot of good ways, in all the best ways. I feel like, to include more people, more activities, more locations, right? I feel like the industry, and maybe you can speak to this certainly, feel like the industry really does pride itself on doing the extreme, right? Going to the highest peak, doing the toughest climb, just doing the extreme, and we like to highlight those activities. I think there's a lot of value in that, but I think we've also seen, the need to recognize and value and validate, well, the trail starts outside of wherever you live, right? Out your front door, that's where the trail starts for some people. And so, especially now during the pandemic, right? It's like cycling has gone up significantly, just walking, running. A lot of people live, nowhere near mountains, but that's my idea of what the outdoor industry is in a lot of ways. And I grew up in the shadow of the Wasatch here. So that definitely influences it. But I feel like we're starting to see the industry recognize and, expand that definition, make that umbrella larger, to include more people from different backgrounds, different activities. What are your thoughts on that? And certainly OIA, Orca, has played a role in that.
I think that is as far as I'm concerned, it has expanded. I mean, you have Trust for Public Land now moving most of their efforts to park within 10 minutes, right? We're part
Hmm.
of a collaboration and a movement. We just haven't, we need to identify it and make it conscious. And that's what the Outdoor Foundation is trying to do right now. And it's getting communities, and these are, Atlanta, Georgia, and Grand Rapids, and Oklahoma City, and San Diego. And you have Native American led communities, you have Black communities, you have Latinx communities, deciding what outdoors means for them and getting multiple repeated exposures. So I think most of the people in the outdoor industry at this point are like, we're great with whatever you want to do outside. It was probably 1991. I left the North Face. I was working on this nonprofit, and I walked in a Marmot store. Marmot used to have multiple stores, and there was a store, Lock Miller owned it, and it was in Berkeley, great famous store. And I was in there, and it was just noted for hardcore. And I was kind of walking around, and it's an old converted church, and I was in kind of their shrine to outerwear. And I was like, wow, I'm feeling kind of weird. I was like, what am I feeling? And the staff had been pretty dismissive of me. They didn't know who I was. And I was like, wow, I'm feeling intimidated. And I was like, that's pretty weird because, I've been in charge of design at the North Face, so I know everything about everything in this jacket. And I was on an Everest climb 3 years ago, right? Like, if I'm feeling intimidated, what does everybody else feel? And that's what the industry was like in 1990. And then you pivot to now, and I think you are seeing, right? I mean, the face of retail has changed dramatically since the advent of the smartphone. But I think you see people willing to not be condescending towards any sort of outdoor activity. But we were talking, I was on the Outdoor Foundation board, and we were talking to one of the executives at the National YMCA. And they run a tremendous number of, as you probably know, young people's camps and outdoor ed. And we were talking about many things. And she said, well, and the marketing from your industry doesn't really help us. And I expected to kind of hear, something about the extreme, right? You guys are too extreme and this, that, and the other. And I said, oh, well, what are you thinking of specifically? And she goes, well, like this hashtag van life thing, which of course is the industry softening itself. She's like, hashtag van life doesn't make sense to most of our community because, they're trying to escape living in cars.
Mm.
And I was like, yeah, we still got a ways to go, don't we? I said, that's not going to go anywhere in the short term because you're still going to have brands that do aspirational things. But I think it highlights the wide divide we have in this country, that projects like Thrive Outside Cities and stuff are seeking to have communities direct themselves and reclaim the outdoors as an American right. I mean, I think it's still a bipartisan issue, and obviously I think it's important. I think I think we should embrace that and work towards that. And look, it's a very audacious goal of really creating community and creating outdoors people.
Right. It's been amazing to see a lot of the work that the Outdoor Foundation is championing and rallying a lot of the brands to participate in, and it seems like the industry has always been values driven, and it's nice to see, especially now, a lot of effort being put behind this around increasing participation across the board, and creating safe places, helping people feel safe participating in these activities. Even just here locally in our community, I'm talking with a small nonprofit just started, 2 cross country, one's a cross country coach, another an Olympian, here in our community. They just wanted to help we have a pretty large refugee community, mostly from, let's see, Somalia, Eritrea. They get placed here, and they wanted to help get these kids out running mostly. So it's a running club. And we live about 5 minutes from our canyon, with a lot of great trail access and trail running. And most of these kids have never gone up the canyon. It's just, they don't feel comfortable, right? Or no one's ever taught them how. So many of these things that are second nature, right, are not second nature. And so, and I know the Outdoor Foundation is doing so much to support, fund, efforts like this. So,
I think it's more across the board too. I mean, you look at Rue Mapp, who's a brilliant social
mm-hmm.
entrepreneur with her Outdoor Afro, which is very much middle class and upper middle class led, but taken, their own experience. And for the African American community, I'm a Southerner. It's like they're reclaiming their space in the outdoors and in the woods. And, that is so gratifying to see. And so, I think there's a bunch of exciting things. I think, look, there's some companies that are doing great in this pandemic in the outdoor industry, and there's some that are not and devastated and near the edge. And so I think it does speak to the community that we're trying to move through this. This is another period of dislocation. But if you look at it, and certainly my time in the industry spans, 35 years now, there have been these phases. And the one thing being outdoors teaches you is you have to evolve to conditions. And so for me, the organizations and the businesses, as long as you keep your values in place, it's the skills you learn outdoors are applicable. You have to look at conditions, you have to change. And I think that's why I've loved my time. I've had a great time in the industry.
Right. Oh, that's great. Well, we'll probably touch on some of the nonprofit work that you've been involved in, because, you're still involved in that. But I wanted to touch on, so that transition from the North Face, you get the opportunity to then go and be the president of Sierra Designs. What went into that decision of wanting to jump back into it? It sounds like with the North Face, you took a step back. What was the motivation behind getting back into the game?
I worked for a nonprofit that Paul Hawken, who did Smith and Hawken, actually had a book which was on the subject of why I went into business, which was really, we would call it now double bottom lines, but he had a brilliant synthesis of basically business is killing the world, but it's the only thing that can save the world. Just sort of, just really a terrific, he had a contract to write the book. And he first wanted me to work for Smith and Hawken, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do product for a while. And so he said, well, why don't you write the book with me? And we had a contract to write this book. It later became the Ecology of Commerce. And I did the research. It was very exciting, very different, right, to be suddenly by myself. But he was having, there were issues at Smith and Hawken. I mean, they were going through, anyway, it became a period where he eventually left Smith and Hawken. But I'd gotten to a point where we kind of had to change our thesis. And I was not excited about writing a book at that point. A good friend of mine had died, and I was with somebody who was in that business transition, because we were essentially writing about doing good business. So I left. I get credit in the paper version of it. But then it led me to work in Colombia doing coca. I actually did product. I did product for Macy's and A16 and a bunch of people. REI bought it, which were, I should have stayed in it, right? It was socks combined with this waste residue, which we brought from Colombia, because we were getting Colombian coca farmers to grow silk rather than cocaine, because, you know, fascinating thing. But anyway, I finally realized that Colombia was an oligarchy and we weren't going to be able to change it beyond our 40 farm families. So I decided, well, I should take what I've learned and go back in. And I had no idea how disrupted Sierra Designs was. I should have, but I thought, well, these people really want to buy it, and I think they're ethical people. It was George Grabner who had done the Conservation Alliance, so I knew him. And that began Sierra Designs, which was, in hindsight, you'd never do it. It was the craziest turnaround ever. I mean, they had this terrible hocus pocus stuff that was coming back in the door. It had been, Jack and Paul had left it for 6 months before, and basically Bill Simon was trying to kill it because he was going to buy the North Face, and they were trying to kill it because they were doing Mountain Hardwear. And you had this product coming back in. You had flat sleeping bags from Light Loft, and then you had 10% defect in tents, and tents were probably their best category. So if I really thought about it, I wouldn't have done that job, but it became a tremendously fun experience. And we changed, I would say, even though the brand kind of got ruined when they moved it out of California, I think we tried to make Bob Swanson and George Marks proud of us, returning Sierra Designs to its really, Sierra Designs did some really innovative things in bags and jackets and stuff early. And we were in service to that. It was, it sounds funny to say, but we thought we knew the real brand, not the one that had been kind of messed around with product that came back and microlights and stuff like that. So might have been a little tilting at windmills, but I think we were successful. We doubled the business and made it profitable, and revolution into product, and did women's sleeping bags that were enormous home run. And Sydney's a little bored. Come on. You're tired of all this talking. Sit.
Well, I was going to mention it. It seems to me, at least, you know, one of the themes that I see throughout, you know, your different experiences with companies is pulling in, you know, other voices, right? And certainly with Sierra Designs, you know, that focus on, you know, people who aren't being served, and in this case, women, you know, making product for women. How much do you feel like that contributed to that turnaround?
We had technical chops, and we did tents, and we did the idea of women's sleeping bags actually came from my Everest trip. And the, but in outerwear, creating a position, it was people were making women's product, but they weren't making it the same way. And I had really respected specialty retailers tell me, Sally, you know, there's no way they'll, you know, women won't buy it. It'll be, you know, terrible. You'll have so much markdown. You have to give me so much more margin and all this stuff. And really, if it hadn't been REI and Candace Johnson and stuff believing, we wouldn't have been able to make that pivot. And so we went from being destitute in outerwear to 3 or 4 years later winning Vendor of the Year in outerwear. And it took some people amplifying our voice, or it wouldn't have happened.
Right. It seems like, especially during that time, this reliance on having someone buy it from you was, I mean, it was critical, right? It's like having an REI being willing to take a chance on it, right?
It was huge. But I will also give credit to Gore, and I'd done a lot of Gore-Tex and knew all the Gore people from North Face, but the owners of Sear Designs, and this was my other lesson in capitalism, they weren't going to give us a dime to invest in it, right?
Mm.
And Gore came through with, I think, $300,000 of, collaborative marketing. And we had Sharon Leacham write a book about how to sell to women for the retailers, which I do have a copy of. I will make sure you get a copy of that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And actually, she would be an interesting interview. But it was, we began to finally get people on board. I mean, it was everything. And I think Gore was looking at their white space and saying, well, we should grow this, and why not? But it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't sold acres of their product probably before elsewhere. And it took every ounce of that. And it was unfortunate because, I mean, Kelwood was not that well managed. They were later bought and broken up. But, George Grabner was a believer. And then they were like, well, how big can this be? So it was, but we had an incredible culture of folks there really trying to honor where that brand came from and take it the next. And so it ended up being tremendously fun and sad for us all. Basically, I think, one person moved basically out to Colorado, and they basically, went through periods of transition after that with the Kelwood breakup, I think.
Right. Was it during this time that you got involved with Outdoor Industry Women's Coalition? Was it because that was 96? But
what's so funny is, at North Face, I had Ann Kirchhoff didn't report to me. She ran customer service, but I said, "Look, Ann, she loved Yosemite, and I said, look, we need somebody handling the relationship with all these climbers, and it wasn't just climbers. It was climbers, skiers, and riders, and we didn't call them athletes back then. They didn't want to be called athletes, by the way. And Ann began to do that. So Ann and I, one, made her interested in her job, so that was good. And two, it worked out great for everybody in that situation. And so she's the one who, she'd been around the industry a lot. I think she started in retail in Santa Cruz, maybe. She and Carolyn wanted to have this cocktail party. So literally, I've never been on the board. I've talked to, I've helped them out at different times. I've done a bunch of things. They've been generous with their recognition, and I've supported it financially in other ways. But I've actually never been on the board there. So there's lots of great people who have been, but from the beginning, it was very easy it was a party. And that was the greatest, actually, that was its strength, I think. And Ann always kind of advocated to, certainly you can have this education part, but let's make it fun. And it went through some periods where it got a little too education-y and maybe not as much fun. And like everything else, it's evolved. So I don't literally, aside from helping to host the party, I can't claim that I did a ton.
Right. So that was 96, kind of that first party, or around that time?
Yeah, it had to, boy, I don't know, honestly.
I'd love to dive in more and I wish Ann were here so we could talk to her more about, the origins, and it'd be great to shed some more light on the early days of that, like the seeds of that idea. And maybe, she shared that with you, but I was curious,
I bluntly know that Ann was like, look, it's hard to find women in this industry. We ought to have a party. And she and Carolyn Cook, and Carolyn, I think, was at Merrill then. And I could hook you up with Carolyn. I probably even have some stuff I'll look and see.
Yeah.
I can tell you, it was in Reno. So we'd have to go back and be like, when was the first one was in Reno. I remember it actually very clearly. And it was extraordinary because, aside from Kitty Bradley at Lowe, and there were a handful of women. There were tons of women in lower level positions, right? That was part of the sad thing of there weren't as many, and I would give Patagonia immense credit, and Yvonne's always on the record for saying he thinks women are better team players, and that's why he's had them. But anyway, I think I'd have to refresh my memory on the dates.
Yeah, and I think we probably have some materials from maybe during the education phase of the organization.
Um,
Seems like there was a little more paper being produced when it was,
there was a
education
lot of
focused, but
there was a lot of that because it did come under OIA briefly,
mm,
and under 90 Cooley was doing it then, and there was a very heavy education part, but it wasn't probably actionable education
right,
necessarily.
right. I,
I prefer the networking. I think is proven to be super helpful for people. That's at least my outside opinion. But there's plenty of board members, so I'm not. You can talk to them.
okay. But it was, and I'm assuming that cocktail party was at Outdoor Retailer in Reno when it was in Reno.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And we didn't
It's
even
outdoor
touch on
retailer.
that. We didn't touch on your involvement in early Outdoor Retailer. What
Well,
what was your connection to those early shows?
we went.
Just as
I think that
participants?
yeah. I mean, obviously, it was a tight industry then. I think Jack can get some of the Miller Friedman and those guys. He's
Mhm.
the right one to talk to about that.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be
But they
great.
were. Let me tell you, the Reno shows were terrifically fun.
Hmm.
It was a small town. It was great. And I do remember when I started, it was weird, right? You had to dress up like in Sunday clothes um, to go to the SIA show. And I lied my way into the SIA show. I said I was a buyer at some shop to get in when I was trying to find a job, and I was camped out at Red Rocks. And I would then go in the bathroom and put on my blue blazer and skirt and go in to SIA to basically lobby for a job.
Hmm.
And then the outdoor portion of our line, SIA was only for ski. And the outdoor portion of our line had to be in what they called the snow show, which was literally at the time in the same building, though sometimes not, in a separate booth. So if you can imagine how far the industry came from ski was sort of king, thought of itself as king, though it was dying at the time. We didn't know it yet, but and outdoor was kind of rising, but it needed to be separated because it was treated so badly. I
Right.
mean, it was that weird. It's kind of and at the time, of course, REI, Lee Turlington and I basically opened REI for the North Face, and that was probably '86. And REI was thought of as discounters, so that was because of the co-op rebate.
Hmm.
So that's how
Well,
much the industry's changed.
well, now to see the industry come full circle and Outdoor Retailer, Snow Show, it's combined, right?
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Well, from there, you make the jump to Camelbak as the CEO. I guess maybe, and I know there's some gaps between Sierra Designs and Camelbak.
Well, the gap is important to complete the circle. So
Right.
I
Absolutely.
decided when they were leaving, nobody wanted to go to Colorado. They thought everybody's like Sierra Designs in Colorado. That doesn't make any sense. But uh, you have to think the dot-com bubble had burst.
Hmm.
And so the owners were like, oh my God, the Bay Area is so scary, right? I mean, the
Mm,
irony is um, it was going to become a great time to be in the Bay Area. But
hmm.
the dot-com thing was sort of a crazy period of keep, the salaries. It was a crazy period out here. So I then came back to realizing that look, capital of these companies and who controls it, what their values are, is incredibly important. And I'd worked for somebody I perceived really was in it for um, either didn't know how to have cost-effective capital and drive the business for what I thought the brand should be. And again, this is me, a little self-righteous youngster. I was like, yeah, I wasn't, profit wasn't the highest motivator, but of course, I think that you create more value when you create something meaningful for people. And then I went to basically somebody that should have been an investor in apartment buildings and not in what could be a high growth brand. And I watched the women who founded Moving Comfort lose their company during a sourcing crisis, probably because they didn't have capital options. And I watched Royal Robbins really, Royal and Liz probably didn't know exactly what they were doing when they sold 51% of Royal Robbins. And then I watched Marmot sell for a fortune in Wall Street for these bankers. And I thought, well, there ought to be somebody from the industry that does this, that can help these entrepreneurs either not lose their company, or if they want to sell, guides them through this, because you only get to do it once unless you're a serial entrepreneur. So a banker that I respected, Nate Pund, who'd sold Mountain Hardware, he looked like he was 12 at the time, and I became partners, and we founded what's called Silver Steep Partners. Silver Steep comes from a Robert Service poem. And we basically just said, we'll talk to anybody, no matter how small, because if you're small, you really can't get this advice. But we were shockingly successful. I mean, we sold Helly Hansen, we sold Eagle Creek, we sold Montreal. We did the service that I imagined. And it was very educational for me to see the whole expense of finance. And during that time, I was asked to be on the board at Camelbak. And I first said no. I had no idea why they paid that much for Camelbak, and it was owned by private equity. And I was interested in private equity, what they would do, but said no. And then they came back and said, please come on. And I thought, well, private equity is going to be this force in the industry. I should understand it. Like, what do you do when you pay too much for a company? So I went on the board, and that was fascinating. And we fired a CEO, and we hired somebody, and we fired them. And then they're like, well, you have to be CEO. And I'm like, I do not. So because by this time I knew a lot more. So I was a little tired of being an investment banker, because I kind of like to sink my teeth into projects versus you do deals. And, I didn't want to do deals all my life. I thought the need was there, and they went on. Silver Steep continued to be very successful, and then they sold out to D.A. Davidson eventually. But I thought, well, I could do an operating gig again. So I basically said, look, I don't know if this will be successful, but the only way you're going to get your money back at this point, because they bought it when the military business was huge at Camelbak, and that was declining rapidly. And they were basically hands-free hydration. They were militantly hands-free hydration, right? So it's not a very big market or a catchy phrase. So my premise was hydration is going to be important in a broad sector, and let's do this. But I said, you'll have to put in money because you've put so much debt on it. I don't think if we get this straightened out, you'll need to support it. So, and the people who owned it were called Bear Stearns Merchant Banking. So I'll never forget we were vendors of the year at REI, and my sales VP and I were there, Elaine Rigney, and they invited you to a leadership conference. And I think Sally Jewell was speaking, and he hits me and goes, look, and Bear Stearns was plummeting that day, right? That was the day of the collapse, basically. And I was scheduled to go out with my CFO and ask for money. We had a growth path now. We were going to get money. So literally, we're out there the day after Bear Stearns is bought by JP Morgan. Everybody is walking out with their box, the whole place is obliterated. And I was like, well, I don't know about our odds. And we go into what they call the investment committee, and we got like the 15 million we needed to do the recapitalization. They were like, Bear Stearns had stepped into the shoes. They're like, well, we either write this all off or we double down. And so that was kind of the epitome of my capital cycle. And then we went through 2 sales at Camelbak. But Camelbak was really fun because it was in the bike business. It was in the military business, and it was in outdoor, and you had to be authentic and hardcore in those spaces, and then broaden to a larger audience. Because our vision was to obsolete disposable single-use bottled water. And we were really core in those 3 areas and had extraordinary product development. But we had to go on the tour of pain to, REI and a bunch of other people to say, look, we're a mission-driven company, and we can't eliminate disposable water just selling at REI, right? We're going to have to sell at Target for our water bottles, and they're not going to ruin the price, and we're going to get to a different market. And we chose to do that and do that up front. And honestly, it didn't affect our business at that point. And so we opened it up. We sold once, we sold again. And fortunately, we sold to a financial I mean, a strategic buyer that I think was a very poor fit, and a lot of people left the company after that. But I would say the 9 years I was there were great, a great culmination of a lot of different things. It was really fun. It was, in the old days, the outdoor industry was very much in the outdoor sports, and cycling was a different world. Cycling still is a little bit of a different world, but it was fun to be in all those spaces. And it was, it was again, a tremendous team. It is an honor to work there.
Right. It seems like kind of similar to similar in a way to Sierra Designs, but different in others. Seems like another theme, right? Is this idea of broadening, the activities that people are participating in. It's like, and that's just, the right thing to do, but also translates into being good for business, right? Like getting out of just being a military supplier, right? Or, just in the bike industry,
Yeah.
can be really limiting. It might feel really good, right? To get those military contracts in a way, but to be able to broaden that base, right? And reach more people who can participate, using your product in different activities has got to feel really good. And so it kind of seems like that was a big theme for you at that time was, expanding the reaching more people where they're at and the activities they're participating in.
Yeah, I think the art was staying core enough and responsive enough, not leaving the people that brought you to the party behind while broadening. And that was threading a needle. And now it's, I think, become a bit more accepted, and I think that's a good thing. But you're right, I hadn't thought about it that way. It's definitely a theme.
What are some of the innovations that you were most proud of during that time? It seems like that product, that category, is just one that's ripe for innovation. I know there's a few in there, but what were some of the highlights there for you when it came to product development?
Well, I think being on the cusp, in fact, we were 6 weeks away from making all of our bottles BPA free before people had
Hmm.
heard of BPA.
Right.
And when the Today Show came on, somebody called me on my drive in and they're like, I think you better watch this. And I remember I was answering the phones for a while because people were calling up, worried that our bottle had caused cancer, right? And so we weren't going to let, we were like, okay, we're all on the front lines of this. And I mean, in point of fact, water bottle was probably like your money and everything else, your receipts were bigger, way bigger issues on BPA, but it didn't matter, right? Because reality is perception. But we were, 6 weeks away from getting that done anyway. And I think we destroyed maybe $1 million worth of product. I mean, that was a case of, again, being true to what you believe, making sure and being true that you could, we had to get BPA out of this tiny little thing on our bite valve bottle, but the Eddie bottle became, it allowed a lot of people who couldn't drink from bottles very easily to drink from bottles. It enhanced people's hydration levels. So the Eddie bottle, the All Clear, which I don't think they make anymore, was the hardest. I think we spent 3 years getting that past the EPA on UV. We built it was a culmination not of my work, but of, I think it was a 12-year project of biologically and chemically hardened reservoir for the military, which was extraordinarily hard product development piece. God, we had endless innovations there, because with hydration, we have this pitcher that I think got Brita to change how their pitcher was done. It didn't prove to be a commercial success, but honestly, it's still in my refrigerator today.
Hmm.
And I still get people asking me how to get that. So the product there was, it was incredibly fun, and it was very engineered. And we also brought back, I mean, we had this great plant in China, but we also repatriated, because of the carbon footprint, making in the USA. And we were way ahead on that. We ran a plant in Mexico, which became lean manufacturing. So all of these, how you manufacture and how you design is always so intertwined. And I'm grateful for the North Face I've understood that from the beginning of my career. So I think while we were even owned by private equity, we articulated our values, we articulated our mission and our vision, and stayed 100% true to that.
Right.
and and that was part of what was so exciting there. And to this day, I use Camelbak products, and I have each company. Like there are several products at Sierra Designs, which are I think are I still see the beauty of living out here is you still see some of that. And when I go skiing at Tahoe, I see some of my worst mistakes in product still on the mountains. So I'm happy to say that from each company, there's pieces that, I'm proud of that I was associated with. But, you know, I'm not a designer. I'm definitely, my thing is, this is what I think we need and who can we bring together? And I think bringing together those people and then holding tight to a vision of, yes, it's going to work and it's going to work for a network of people.
Right.
Is,
Well, while you weren't hands-on sketching out the products themselves, I mean, you saw a lot of products through that process at different levels. Are there any that stick out to you that you saw in the wild for the first time, and you were an instrumental part in, or at various levels in helping produce that product? Did you have any? Did you have a first moment where you noticed a product out in the wild that you had been a part of?
that's a fun question. I'm sure it happened at the North Face, right? I mean, I'm sure like I beat up on Mark for the 4-pound tadpole and tent and uh, the, I, and obviously the expedition systems, a lot of those concepts came out of my Everest trip. I don't remember it as much. I think one of the really fun ones was the women's sleeping bag, the Annie Oakley and the Calamity
Hmm.
Jane. I mean, we sold 18,000 of those bags
Wow.
in year one, and which is an extraordinary amount of bags to sell. Um, and I took a lot of grief on that. And I was just like, wait a minute, you specialty shops are selling women who are making 68 cents on the dollar a heavier bag that's harder to heat because they're asleep colder than men. But yet we're making one that has insulation at the right places and is more the right size. And so I was getting pushback from shops. Meanwhile, Will Steger was like, I'm short and this is a better built bag and I'm going to use this.
Hmm.
I mean, so I think that one, I remember that because I definitely took quite a bit of heat for it, which is so odd because it's such a clear usage. It's not shrink it and pink it. It's nothing
Hmm.
like that. But that one's particularly memorable. That and the Pontetordo range of fleece. Gib Mann had brought us Pontetordo, this Italian fleece, and it was single layer, beautiful fleece, and we did some classic stuff in that. And I still get notes from people about that
Hmm.
line. I mean, so there's some of those that are for various reasons. But I have to say, I can't say that I was great at ski wear. And when I had to do probably 2 years of ski wear at North Face, I do cringe sometimes when I see those on the slopes. So I think it's human nature to worry about some of your failures, but I guess it's a good thing they're still skiing in it. And now it's kind of classic ugly 80s. So
Well, that part, even if you're not especially proud of certain items, it does have to feel good seeing some of those original pieces being used still. I mean, that's the point, right? It's
yeah,
hopefully.
I never had a quality. I never worked anywhere in the outdoor industry where I felt like it wasn't meant to last for a long time and people didn't stand behind it. And I think it's so easy to work in the outdoor industry. And yeah, we're all creating consumer products and we're creating some waste, but we're definitely creating things that last.
Yeah, that's good. You don't feel like you ever had to compromise on that. It kind of leads me into my next question. Really, how did you maintain that? How did you keep? I think when I go to the outdoor retailer show, or used to in person, um, sometimes you walk around the show and you just see a lot of, you could take labels off of every jacket and line them up. And, in some ways it's, you can't tell a difference between all the puffy jackets. Right. And so there's a lot of that. It's like, oh, change the zipper here, change the colorway, for every season. Um, Obviously there's still a lot of good, there's a lot of innovation, a lot of good product being made. How did you keep yourself from just making more stuff for more stuff's sake? How did you push yourself to be a part of organizations and teams, and push your teams to make stuff that actually matters?
I don't think it's any great accomplishment on my part. It's probably how I think.
Hmm.
And it has to sort of make sense in a big picture to come to the small picture. I think that's probably why I stunk at skiwear, because the conventional wisdom was that you needed to have different collections.
Mm.
And so the ones that failed didn't always have a reason to be. They might have been straight fashion. I will say that there was one time that I failed, that I didn't use the spec that I would have liked, and that was in the building out the expedition systems. I'd used what was called the Denali Jacket. I still have it at 2 pounds a down on Everest, but it had a heavy external fabric. And, I probably would have wanted to use Gore, but I think honestly, it might have been when they were doing their guaranteed to keep you dry, and that inhibited design. Actually, that made things look too much alike, frankly, till Arc'teryx came along. Um, but I made it in this coated fabric. It's called the Sagamartha Parker, which is another name for Everest. And that's the one that I was like, wow, this is kind of weird. We only made like 500 because not that many people have that use for that much down. And I was like, well, that's weird. We've sold out. And I looked at it and I was like, we've sold out in Detroit. And I didn't know it at the time, but basically it was, drug dealers and stuff standing out on the street buying that jacket.
Mm.
So like unintended consequences, but that was one that was not, it later I think became Pertex or Gore or whatever else as it should have been. But I think of that one time where you're hitting a price point or something and you didn't call it the right way. And I think that that happened very few times. And I would say that people underestimate how important it was as China was developing, that the designers of this industry got freedom in incredible sewing, incredible techniques. Um, and, and for a while there, I have plenty of friends at Gore, but Gore didn't get their textiles on time, and Malden didn't get their stuff on time. And that's where going to Pontetorto or going to Japan. I went to Japan to source fabrics and stuff, and going globally push that, because you need fabrics and you need the ability to do different sorts of sewing, and then there became the innovation of making it simple again, and that has a little to do with fashion and stuff. But I think that's what Sierra Designs was pushing ahead of its time. I mean, Sierra Designs did wool ahead of its time, way ahead of the merino lines, and but some of those timeless designs, and striking that balance has always been a super interesting part for me. And then of course I think you said it earlier, you were prescient in the retailers were gatekeepers. So and I remember one of my reps saying, it was Al Gunner saying, reps can't tell you, they can tell you what's selling, they can't tell you what's going to sell. Mm. And so I think there is, for as much as the corporate consolidation is, there's a lot of direct to consumer. And I just bought some lightweight gear for backpacking again. I'm getting older. I want the lightest gear again. It's like, it's back to that cycle of where there are more garage businesses and stuff. And they may not scale the same way or ever, but there is a renaissance in accessibility and the maker movement that I think is also exciting and kind of returns us.
Right. No, absolutely. I totally agree. I guess with that said, just to kind of wrap up, I guess, your time with Camelbak, 2016, you stepped down. Is that right?
Yeah, we sold in August of 2015, and I stepped down January of 2016.
Right. So that frees you up in a way. I'm sure sometimes you probably feel like you're busier than ever still, right? But with that, you get a little more time to go and actually do what this is all about, right? Go outside, get out there, enjoy the outdoors. What are some of the brands that now stand out to you? Some of these up and coming ones, or the garage brands that are out there. Who's doing interesting things out there from your perspective now that you probably get to sit back and be a user again?
Yeah, it's funny because of course I have friends in a lot of brands, so I'm loath to say some of that. I've got an Ulta pack over there that I actually ended up liking quite a lot. and I've been more in the ultra lightweight, and I like honestly BioLite spin on that whole category. And I think Jonathan Cedars is a super interesting leader. He's a new generation. What he's doing, combining power in Africa along with some of his, like his headlamps, I think are awesome.
Hmm.
And so I think in interesting areas that there hadn't been innovation, there's beginning to be innovation again. And I think, like you see, basically you could take the designs from the 1960s and Herschel, which is not quote in the outdoor industry, they've made a fortune. It's probably a $200 million company taking our looks and doing it somewhere else. But what I like is that there's not as much, I like the breakdown of um, outdoor activities and what's outdoor and what's fashion. And I think that mashup's a lot of fun. So
Right.
I see brands experimenting, but I also see in the hard goods area beginnings of real innovation and dispersed power. And honestly, it's fun to see what van life has done in some of these other areas. So I don't want to go too much into which brands I like. And I will say that 2 weeks after I left Camelbak, I fractured my ankle in 3 places skimboarding. So I was
Oh,
too old to
wow.
be skimboarding. So it set me back, but I'm spending more time, hopefully skiing this year and mountain biking. That's the North Rim behind me. And look, bike is an area where you think the outdoor is obsessed with gear. I mean, bike, you could spend $50,000 at the Euro bike without blinking.
Right.
So I'm happy that there are people making niche products, um, and then I think there are other older brands being renovated, and then there's brands from uh, outside this country that I'm looking at that I think are have something to offer the U.S. too. That's kind of fun.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. I wanted to ask you. Well, I wanted to run through the 7 habits of Sally McCoy.
Yeah.
I read this out there. This was written out there, but I wanted to go through the 7 habits and then ask you a question about them. So,
Yeah.
number 1, leave everything better than you found it. 2, know who owns your company and what their goals are. 3, they can't say no if you don't ask. 4, choose the company culture wisely. 5, network. It's okay to be transactional. 6, set goals. 7, care about what you do and how you do it. It's funny. A lot of these points have come up throughout our conversation naturally. I think it's great that these are written out. From your perspective, or do any of these resonate with kind of just where you're at right now and what you're doing? I know you were involved in the Outdoor Foundation as the chair just recently, but step down from that. But right now, just in the current state of your life, any of these jump out at you or resonate, especially now?
I think they're all still true, right? I mean, I think it's pretty simple philosophy when you boil it down to that. But I think that it's every one of those is, I do think you have to leave it better than you found it. I do think obviously we've dwelt a lot on capital, and culture is terribly important. So I've been I was on the Zoomies board from 2010 and I stepped down as lead director this year. But I'm on 2 public boards and with different capital structures, but culture is terribly important anywhere. And I think cultures with articulated values um, is, I'm only interested in that. And I've only worked with companies that um, are interested in, you have to get up every day and live your values, right? You have to get up every day and live your mission. Um, and you have to be willing to look at it and say, how do we need to change? So I think the way I've done I've got kids who are now juniors in high school, so I've been able to spend a bunch of time with them. And my wife's working on a book, so it's been really fun to be a participant. And those values actually 100% stay the same. I'm still on the Outdoor Foundation board, supporting that. And I think I always try to make sure I have one nonprofit I'm giving a significant amount of time to. And then I basically looked at things of like, what can I give something to? What can I learn something from? Because I'm not very good if I'm not learning. It doesn't keep my interest. And then, but I'm beginning to, I've had kind of a portfolio activity. I'm beginning to narrow it down, and I'm looking at a interesting project potentially that I'll pick up and skinny some things down. So I'm still, um, I'm still interested in those 7 things. I hadn't thought about them as my habits, but they sort of guide what I'm interested in. I mean, I think the election's taken up a lot of people's time this year, and how do you participate in democracy? And I see that as enormously important. I think this decade's going to be a tumultuous one. So I do think the outdoor industry may have a significant role to play in that. To being outdoors is very bipartisan. Ironically, it's probably the only thing that's been done this year that there's great support on both sides of the aisle for. It was the Great American Outdoors Act, and I feel like we've been lobbying for that as an industry since, well, forever, but certainly since '93. So I think there's still a voice out there for all of us, and I think it'll be interesting for the industry to, as it around the trade show. I think personally, when there's a vaccine, people will want to congregate. And is it a trade show, or is it something like the rendezvous, or how are we going to do it? And but I think the industry should be aware it's part of something special. I realize there's a lot of executives feeling a tremendous amount of pressure. But I think you've always got to keep your eyes open on what you're a bigger part of, because we're a tiny industry. Mm-hmm. And but I will say the community's been more valuable, much as, and I do love product and I do love organizations, but the community writ large is, it's worth your time.
That's great. Maybe kind of a last question, unless you have some other thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up. But, I read that once when you were 10, you told your dad that you wanted to be a ranger because that's the job that you could do and work outside. He gave you a response that I thought was interesting. If you don't mind sharing that.
That's the one where he said, I remember actually where I was when I asked him that, but he said that was probably a good job because it would still be a man's world when I was an adult. Is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah.
And that, that pissed me off. He was telling me the truth. Mm-hmm. And he knew how much I love the outdoors, and he did too. And I've been blessed. Sally Jewell count her among friends, and I've certainly known a lot of people in the interior. But I think he was. I was feisty and ornery, and I was like, well, that's got to change. And there has been real progress. And look, Kamala Harris stands a decent chance of becoming vice president, and I think that's great. But I think it's I never really let that kind of define me. I mean, I didn't think twice that I assumed people would change. And if I look back now, I look back at my college, I look back at the outdoor industry, and certainly there were a lot of really progressive people, and women too. Women are a part of the culture. So you see women who are against, I wrote my college thesis on women who oppose suffrage and women who oppose DRA. But you're all part of the culture, but it has changed and gotten broader, and it's my hope that it still continues to. And the outdoor industry's big awareness with our, I think heart's always in the right place, but how do we do it? How do we broaden it? How are we more welcoming? And I think experimenting with different ways of doing that is going to be our next challenge. And look, if being open to more cultures is going to change the fashion and the products and everything else. And I think that's tremendously exciting. Like I think about D.G. Rinehard, who was a woman who worked at REI for years. And she retired at one point from REI, and she used her life savings, and D.G. is African-American, to create a plus size women's clothing line. This might've been 15 years ago. And it was really pre-Shopify and internet.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't commercially successful. So she ended up going back to Nordstrom's and then back to REI. But I think of that sort of a pioneer. And I think of there's a DG Rinhard now and there's a Shopify and there's an industry. And look, it's very difficult to talk about cultural competency. And it's a real challenge. And for all of us, for me, for sure. But I think that's the outdoor industry. Our hearts are in the right place and we'll trundle forward. And we can't be afraid to not try.
Right. Well, and this whole series that we've been doing is all about the history of the industry, but I like to tease out, okay, where is the industry may potentially leading us in the future? And so I like leaving this more on that optimistic note of the future of the industry being really bright. And I see that too. And we're all a part of, trying to find actionable ways of making that happen. And learning, looking back in the past and seeing kind of where we've been, and hopefully that helps lead us to where we're going. I think is a positive thing. But what are there any things that we missed? I know you've done so many things in this industry. I wanted to make sure we covered it all, and we haven't done it justice nearly. Um,
Oh, there's tons of stories and things, but certainly in certain terms of the major pieces that are the arc so far of my life we've hit.
I was going to say that, I mean, there's a few more chapters, plenty more chapters to be told. That was the same thing that I ran into with Jim and Greg Thompson. Like they've kind of had multiple chapters, when we kind of went through the different eras of their careers. I mean, there's a whole nother, I'm sure there's plenty more coming. I'm sure you're incubating on that right now. So we'll do a part 2 at some point if you'd ever want to do that.
All right, Jason, I'm happy
Um,
to, if I can be of use to you.
Well, this has been really helpful, and appreciate your willingness to help connect us with other people who are instrumental in the building up of this industry. And we're just interested in helping tell those stories. So appreciate you being willing to share yours.
Oh, it's an honor. Thank you. And I'll be happy to do some work and I'll be in touch on email on those other topics.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jason. Bye-bye.